We are going to be tight on time anyway, so
Bill, are we still waiting on Mike at all, or is he joining us, or Mattioli?
Thank you, Jess. I didn't realize that Mike wasn't on yet. I have just sent him an email a little while ago in case he had the wrong Zoom link, so I sent him this link by an email a few minutes ago. So I will welcome you. Welcome everybody. Those of you I don't know, my name is Bill Bloomquist. I'm a senior research fellow in the Ostrom workshop. Today we are very happy to share with you this jointly sponsored event hosted by two Ostrom workshop research programs, the still relatively new Commons program and the newly expanded Environment and Natural Resource Governance program. That program will be co-directed by Dean Luke and Jess Steinberg. Dean is a member of our Roundtable of Discussants today, and Jess and I are sharing MC duties today. Thanks to David Price and Allison Sturgeon and Emily Castle, and of course Scott Shackelford for their support for today's event. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our lead presenter, who, along with Roundtable Discussant Bob Costanza, is joining us at 7 a.m. on Thursday from the Australian National Capital, Canberra. Dr. Ida Kubiszewski is an associate professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. She is a prolific scholar whose list of publications requires one to scroll down one's screen at least more than once to take it all in. Professor Kubiszewski also plays multiple leadership roles in the international scientific community as associate director, originally founding managing editor, associate editor, and originally founding managing editor of the journal Solutions, and a member of the advisory boards or steering committees for Ecosystem Services, Anthropocene Review, the Veblen Institute for Economic Reforms, and the Club of Rome. So, and she also is part of a startup, she was telling us just before we got on. So 7 a.m. doesn't mean nothing to her because she never sleeps anyway. Please join me in welcoming Ida Kubiszewski. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Ida.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks very much. Let me share my screen. Everybody seeing my screen? Yep, okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I am a morning person, so the 7 a.m. thing is actually quite okay. If you had said 10 p.m., I'd have an issue with. So 7 a.m. is okay. I'll talk a little bit about property rights and the characteristics of resources, and try to make it relatively quick so we can have a good discussion at the end. I just want to point out that all the papers I do talk about today, and all my papers basically, you can find on my website. So take a look if you are interested in any of these. So this is a pretty standard graph. I'm assuming that everybody has seen it. This one's looking specifically at ecosystem services, which is an area which I talk about. So rival versus excludable. And you have, on the one hand, rival and excludable goods, cotton, apples, timber examples. And on the other side, you have the very public goods on the opposing side that are a bit different. But what I'd like to talk about is a slightly different graph today. And it's the idea that it's not as black and white as putting it into a matrix. So there are sources that are rival and scarce. So whether it's that timber or apples or clothing, one person uses it, not around for the other person. On the other hand, you have things like wild game or fish in the ocean that are a bit harder to deal with. So they're not quite excludable because excludability changes quite a bit depending on technology, depending on what's going on. So let's talk about fish in the ocean, for example. Fish in the ocean, really hard to track. You can't really exclude anybody from going out into the open ocean and fishing. But these days, you kind of can't. With technology, with GPS, with policies to track that GPS, you can track exactly what somebody is, where somebody is fishing, how they're fishing, and what they're fishing. So technology is changing. So then you have, so that's scarce goods, but then you have rival and abundant. So parks, regulating and cultural ecosystem services, atmospheric oxygen. Those are all rival. They are abundant, but they are congestible. And we've seen that with climate change. We've seen that with overpopulation. That is becoming an issue. You also have non-rival goods. So goods that if I'm using doesn't prevent you from using. Protection from the ozone is one of them. You can't really exclude somebody from being protected from ozone, no matter what you do and how much technology really put out there. And even another stage of these goods is non-rival and additive. So other people using them actually improves them. So think about this. We're using Zoom. If you were the only one in the world using Zoom, how helpful would it really be? You could talk to yourself, but that's about it. Same thing with internet. The reason it's so useful is because everybody else is using it. And so they're actually additive. I have an idea, I give it to Bill. Bill has a brilliant idea, changes the world, right? And it adds, it doesn't take away. That doesn't mean I still don't have my original idea. And so why do we expect goods and services that are at that level to be managed at the same level as things like clothing? And it comes down to trying to put a square into, there's a saying, it's a square hole, round peg, or the other way around. I'm not really sure what's saying, but it goes something like that. And you guys know what I mean. And so basically by trying to create one type of governance system or one kind of institute to measure all of them, that's exactly what we're doing. So let's talk about markets. And a lot of you already probably know this, but so right now we're doing that by creating patents and copyrights. So this is a slightly older map, but this is how many patents were granted all over the world in 2002. I did check, they have not updated this, but it's the same message basically, because looking at the numbers, nothing has changed. So if you look at how many patents were granted in 2002, is about 312,000. So the size of the country is how many patents were granted. So you could see that Africa is almost non-existent. South Africa, almost non-existent. New Zealand coming in there. A lot of the Asia Pacific countries not existing. Sorry, this is Australia, this is New Zealand right here. However, if you look at royalties, that gets exaggerated. And so a lot of times with patents and copyrights, so just flipping between the two, look at, this is Japan, by the way. So between the two, you can see that a lot of these countries, US most notably, many in Europe, are creating patents to get the royalty rights. And that's been a big issue. So if you look at, for example, also number of patents and that were granted and applied for in the US through 2019, you see that that's been going up really quickly. And at this point, about 60% of grants are granted when applied for. So, and this has been changing. So the legalities of it has changed over the years. So in 1887, for example, we joined the Paris Convention, which basically said that everybody in the convention acknowledges their patents. In 1930, we could start patenting plants and various plants out there. In 1980, publicly funded projects and things that were developed were able to be patented. So all of a sudden, universities started going out for patents quite a bit as well. And you see, if you look at numbers of how much patents universities ask for, that's skyrocketed as well. So this world has changed. The other problems with the market is it creates dead weight lost through the creation of monopolies. Monopolies kind of hold on to it and block everybody else up. It prioritizes economic demand. What I mean by that is let me give you quick example. So I put here African sleeping sickness. So at one point, India found a new chemical. They went to the WHO and said, can you figure out what this new chemical does? Pretty standard operation. So they went to, the WHO took this chemical and they went through and looked, sent it around, can anybody figure out what this chemical is for? They themselves had researchers looking into it. One company came back from California saying it's really good at removing facial hair from women. WHO at the same time found that it was really good at curing African sleeping sickness. So something that kills a lot of people in Africa. There was a semi-cure. It was very painful, worked 50% of the time, so on. This was a much better cure. The original group that found it, it was sent back to them, and there were two variants of this chemical. They decided to basically produce only the one that helped women remove facial hair, because that was where economic demand was. People in Africa didn't have the money to have economic demand. Even though it was a life-saving issue, they didn't have the money. So that's what didn't produce. There was public outcry, and they did make a lot of it for Africa eventually, but it took convincing and getting there. So economic demand decides where it goes. So, and then monetary value set private ownership. So should ecosystems be private? Can they be private? Productivity, there's a lot of Me Too research. So one company develops a product, the other one tries to develop exactly the same thing. So reproducing all that research instead of sharing and expanding. And patent trolling. So golden rice, an example, scientists developed golden rice, which had a lot more vitamin A in it, tried to give it away for free to developing countries, and found that they're imposing on 12 different patents and were basically sued and couldn't give it away. So a lot of issues. And then the idea that federally funded research can then be patented. And so basically public pays twice for it. They pay once when they're paying their taxes, which then go to funding the research, and they're paying again when they're buying the product, which is patented. Any questions? I prefer interruptions with questions than waiting to the end. Okay. And the question is, who decides? At the moment, it's the market that decides. Who decides what we should be inventing, what we should be looking for? So when we look at climate change, there is a lot of technologies coming out, but if there's something that can help climate change, but isn't part of the market, who decides we should produce that? Who decides whether we should spread that globally? If US develops a technology that's perfect, are we going to send it to China or India or Africa if they can't afford it? Who decides how food is distributed? How much food is produced where? who decides how inequality is dealt with? A major issue of our times. Who decides who gets the money and where it goes? So there's a lot of issues around basically deciding what products. There is one way of deciding is, for example, the reward for monetary prizes has been used internationally for a long time. So France, for example, started it in 1600s with asking for a workable water turbine, which they then received. England to solve longitude at sea. France needed to solve a problem to transport food for Napoleon's armies, and the technique of canning food was developed. New York, a private investor, wanted to get transoceanic air travel going. And so he had a prize from traveling to New York to Paris nonstop, and that happened. And there's been more recent ones of things around getting code written. And then the most famous one is the X Prize, where it has been around astronomy. They've had prizes for sending people and shuttles really easily and inexpensively into space. They're the ones, those companies are now supplying the space station with food. And the most recent one, I just found that in 2021, they actually have a prize around carbon capture. And looking at whoever can basically efficiently capture and remove 10 gigatons of carbon by 2050. So these prizes are happening, but these days they're happening by independent private corporations instead of governments with a vision, excuse me, saying this is a really big issue in our country or in the world. Let's find the money to solve this. There has been an act that was passed a few years ago giving government agencies in the US the right to put up prizes for up to $50 million. Excuse me. That has not happened and been used as of yet. The other way to look at it, so one is prizes. The other one is looking at open source software and how open source software has been created. And often that has solved a lot of large problems just because it rewards people with reputation instead of just money. And so a lot of problems on the internet have been solved in slightly different way than just paying people. We recently came out with, and you'll notice that Bob is first author in this, so I'm not going to say too much about it because I'm sure he wants to talk about it, so I'm going to leave that to him. But we recently came out with a paper around common asset trust and looking at how a trust can be set up and run. We did look at Elinor Ostrom's 8 core design principles, which all of you probably know really well, and then applying them to trust and how that would actually be seen within a trust. We also look at the public trust doctrine, which I'm positive Bob will talk about more, because it's really his thing. But basically looking at that, this is law back from Roman times that allows for these kind of trusts to be set up. And this is not a way to develop new information, but it is a way to manage certain goods that might not fit well into the market. So, and I'll leave it at that just to give us plenty of time. You said 20 to 25 minutes, so right in the middle.
Thank you so much. Jess is going to take over from here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ida, for that presentation. It was really interesting and thought-provoking, and I especially enjoyed the categorizations early on is a nice, helpful way of setting the stage for our conversation. So now we would like to sort of open it up to some comments from our roundtable participants, who I'm going to briefly introduce. And then we'll hear from them. And then after that, we'll open it up to a broader discussion across all of our participants today. So I think first, I'd like to introduce Bob Costanza, right, who Ida and Bill have already mentioned and is joining us from Australia this early hour in the morning. Thanks again, we really appreciate it. And it's nice to meet you. I have not met you, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts on the subject. Bob Stanz is a professor and vice chancellor in chancellor's chair in public policy at the Crawford School. He's a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center, a senior fellow at the National Center for Science and Environment, an affiliate fellow at the Good Institute. He's got lots of titles and a Tao Master of Ecological Economics at the Tao Masters Academy in Shanghai. Also, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and the Royal Society of Arts in the UK, and has a variety of other titles that I'm gonna cut short at this point. He is co-founder and past president of the International Society of Ecological Economics and writes on ecosystem services, ecological environment. As you saw, works along with Ida on some of the work that she discussed just now. So I'll briefly introduce Dean as well, and then we can just have comments. You don't have to be interrupted by my introductions again. So we will also hear from Dean Luke, who's a professor of economics and co-director of the program on environment and natural resource governance at the Ostrom Workshop here at IU. He has served as the John Olin Faculty Fellow in Law and Economics at Yale, and is a distinguished visiting professor of law and economics at the University of Toronto as well. And his work spans a range of areas, including property rights, agricultural economics, law and economics, and even the economics of wildfire suppression. So, and we had expected to have a third roundtable participant today, but it looks like he's unable to make it. So we're sorry to see that. But we will, I think, be more than happy with the comments from Bob and Dean today, and then we'll open it up to our conversation. So Bob, if we could start with you, that would be wonderful. And then we'll move on to Dean.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I remember fondly the few times that I was able to visit the workshop there at IU and work with Lynn Ostrom and others. So it's glad to be back virtually, at least. Ida mentioned the paper that we published recently about common asset trusts, and I guess I'll just say a few words about that, because I think that's an institution that I think can be, excuse me, it's still early. I haven't had my coffee in a while now. It's an institution that we can use to better manage these kinds of commons resources. And there is some legal precedent there with the public trust doctrine, which you may have heard of. And there's a really good book by Mary Wood that came out recently called Nature's Trust that describes the public trust doctrine, which basically says that governments have the responsibility to protect the commons. And they're obviously not doing that very well. They do it for a few kinds of commons like open water and beaches. But the commons that are really important these days are the atmosphere, the open oceans, natural capital in general, and ecosystem services. So how do we go about managing them more effectively? And I think that's where Lynn Ostrom's ideas about how to manage commons really come in. And in this paper, we sort of linked her design principles with this idea of common asset trusts, which goes back to some ideas that Peter Barnes had in his book, Capitalism 3.0, some of you may have seen. And Lynn and Peter and I and a few others wrote a short paper in Science back in 2008 about setting up an Earth atmospheric trust. So let's think of the atmosphere as a global commons that we all basically own together. How do we manage that as a trust? And the idea is that once you've assigned those property rights, once you sort of have clearly defined boundaries and all of the other 8 characteristics that Lynn listed in her design principles, then you can begin to, charge those who damage the trust for that damage. You can collect those revenues and put them into a financial package. And then you can reward those who benefit the trust, who transition to renewable energy, who sequester carbon, by enhancing, restoring ecosystems and their services, etc. And that idea has been used in other ways. In fact, the payment for ecosystem services system in Costa Rica, which has been quite successful, essentially functions this way. And most of the PES systems in the world that actually work well don't function as conventional markets for ecosystem services. They really have some sort of government or quasi-government institution that uses financial incentives to get the kind of behavior that they want. The system in Costa Rica collects revenues from gasoline taxes and water users, and uses that to fund farmers to convert, from cattle ranching to planting forests. So I don't know why I'm losing my voice here. Anyway, and Costa Rica is currently planning to expand that system to cover more than forests, but to cover the entire country, all of their natural capital assets, both terrestrial and marine. And so we've been working with them about thinking of this as a national common asset trust, thinking of the entire country, all of the natural capital assets as being held in that way, and using Lynn's design principles to help design that new system. So I think there's a lot of room for these new kinds of institutions that can better handle all of the commons resources that we have, and the work that we've done in the past trying to quantify the value, the contribution to human well-being of those commons resources shows that, in fact, that's the majority of support for human well-being. It comes from our natural and social capital commons, not from our marketed goods and services that are quantified in GDP. So, in the Anthropocene era that we're currently in, we have to recognize the growing interdependence between humans and the rest of nature. We have to begin to recognize the value of these common asset resources. We can no longer leave them as open access, but we also don't want to privatize them and convert them into marketed goods and services. We need this third sector of the economy. We need the commons sector, and I think this idea of common asset trust is one way to implement that idea in a way that's consistent with all of the work that Lynn and the workshop have done over the years. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Much appreciated. Dean, do you wanna offer your thoughts, and then we'll open up. It looks like we've got some good questions in the chat, and after Dean speaks, I think between Bill and I will sort of keep a queue of these questions so we can make sure that they make it into the forum. All right. So Dean, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Bill and Jess for organizing this, and Ida for your talk, and nice to see everybody here. I just have a couple things, and it's basically a comment on this typology that Ida.
I have a comment and a question.
Excuse me. Okay. Comment on this matrix structure that Ida spoke about at the beginning of her talk, both the one that she put up at first and sort of the modified version. And I think I've seen a lot of these over the years. I think there's a little bit of confusion, at least from my perspective, with that kind of typology. There are some characteristics of goods, such as rivalness and so forth, but excludability is not a characteristic of a good. It is an outcome that depends on benefits and costs and decisions made by people. And so you can exclude wildlife. Kruger Park in South Africa is a fenced property of 5 million acres or so. And there are lots of private ranches nearing hundreds of thousands or more acres in which they also essentially own the wildlife. People who raise salmon basically track them through their migratory behavior from a spawning site to ultimately a harvest site. So these things, and when Ida mentioned technology, she was implicitly talking about the costs and benefits of monitoring, excluding people, and so forth. So I think it would be useful to separate characteristics of goods from governance choices, and I think they're kind of mixed up in that kind of standard matrix. And that's really all I have. I know we've got 40 or 50 people here and a short amount of time, so I'll leave it at that and let other people engage in the discussion. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dean, for that. I appreciate it, and I'm not sure. So we have a nice queue going so far in our chat. So I'm just going to use the order of questions in the chat to sort of dictate our conversation and our questions for our panelists, if that's okay with everyone. And then also, of course, Bob and Ida and Dean, feel free to sort of jump in at any point, either in response to each other or the questions. So I think the very first question we had was from Greg Bloom. Do you wanna say your question out loud, or would you prefer that I read it from the chat, Greg?
I'm sort of remote at the moment, so I don't even remember what I wrote. I mean, I remember the gist. I'm basically trying to figure out if digital goods can fit into this matrix, or whether the matrix actually has to be adapted for those purposes, since there are very different characteristics.
Yeah, good question. Ida, or who would like to?
So, yeah, I can tackle this first, and then whoever wants to pick up. But so yes, digital goods, and I had, especially with the additive goods, a lot of digital goods are sort of additive because with a lot of technology, it requires other people to use it as well. Internet as a whole, a lot of these communications platforms, Zoom, Skype, however you want to look at it, the more people that use it, the more important it is. I don't know if any of you use WhatsApp, for example. The reason it became so useful is because everybody started using it, and now everybody's shifting off, and it's becoming a lot less useful. And so these things come in trends. But you asked specifically, Greg, about something like open source software. And I think that definitely improves with the more people using it, especially from the creation part. Because think of, for example, Firefox. Firefox is an open source software. The more people that used it, the more people that found bugs, the more people that fixed it or reported them if you weren't technical, and it improved over time. And that's true about a lot of other software as well. Open source software is that with time, it's improved just because people saw the bugs, more people had eyes on it, and more people were coding it and were interested. And it became a little community. So I have a friend who works with Firefox quite a bit in the coding community. And he said that they have their own little awards structures. They have their own sort of way of rewarding community members for doing a really good job. And it's not with money. It's with basically recognition. Academics work on the same kind of reward structure. For example, can't say I'm making my millions working for academia, right? None of us are. And our reward structure is through being acknowledged through citations, through getting information out there, through publishing papers. So the reward structure, instead of unlike patents and copyrights, which is holding information back, our reward structure is by putting it out there and having people use it. The more people use it, the more we're rewarded. So how can we potentially change those reward structures in broader society to be more like technology? Thanks, Greg.
Do you know of examples of this matrix that have been adapted for digital goods? Because I think there's even more fine-grained distinctions. There's some kinds of data that could be, there's some kinds of data that do need to be, walled off. And GDPR is like an example of a first clumsy step in that direction. And it would be great to start thinking about digital goods across a similar matrix, because they don't quite neatly fit into the classic one.
Right. I don't know where it's been applied specifically, I have to admit. I know sort of the big public goods, but yes, there is data that's whether national security or other things that needs to be held off. But the other thing is that with data, it's really hard to put a wall in front of it. And people try and people do really good, but looking at the hacks that are out there, it is really difficult, right? To kind of do that. So hackers have shown that once it's produced, that technology, and well, once that's produced the information, it does get out there eventually. So I don't know, to your original question, where it's been used specifically.
So thanks for that question, Greg. I think the next in our list was Maria Garulis. Did you want to say yours, or did you want me to read it aloud? Oh, maybe I'll just read it. So I'm not seeing. So this was a question about the typology, how the typology is helpful for governance, especially when talking from experiences with actual governance officials. Can you share a couple of anecdotes or examples where these types of typologies actually come in handy when thinking about questions of governance?
Well, I think with governments, I think it's important to realize that all these different types of goods and services have different characteristics. And whether, Dean, you include excludability or not, that's a separate kind of issue, but they do have different characteristics. They don't fit into the pretty box. And so I think what governments like Costa Rica that Bob mentioned, and we mentioned in our paper, are starting to realize is that you can't just depend on the traditional institutions and government methods to manage them appropriately. Look what the market has done to the environment over the last 50 years with climate change, with degradation. And so what are those different governance structures? So Costa Rica, for example, is implementing the common asset trust. And that's how they're trying to deal with it. They've had a payment for ecosystem services for quite a few years. They're probably the most advanced in the world. And so what are other governance and institutions that can manage? And I think where the typology would come in handy is realizing that these different goods and services do have different types of characteristics and then need to be handled in different ways. They can't all be handled in the same way.
Maybe to quickly add to that and respond to Dean's question that the characteristics of the goods are the rivalness axis, and the excludability is obviously something that we can change depending on how much effort we want to put into it. Whether that has to do with trying to wall off the digital world but the difficulties and the expense of doing that depends on what the technology is, and also on the characteristics of the goods. There is a very different thing, those two axes, but they're both important to understand. And I think they are having some impact on at least a few governments in terms of recognizing that social and natural capital have to be managed differently because of where they fit on this matrix.
Thanks for that clarification, Bob, but true.
Great. I think the next person in our queue was Lucas. Did you want to ask your question about sort of governance, I think, and authorization and legitimacy is what it sort of looks like you're interested in? I can't quite tell who has who typed their question because they can't be, their microphone's not working. So I will ask it if if that is okay. Lucas was interested in understanding, he sort of mentioned Bob's explanation of the global commons and how it can be governed through trust as long as boundaries are clearly defined. And the sort of other other principles are addressed. But how can the other principles, mainly the acceptance of authorization of such governance systems, be addressed? With national sovereignty being the highest authority in global governance, how can a global trust accomplish that acceptance?
Yeah, well, under the public trust doctrine, the trustees for a global commons like the atmosphere are basically all of the governments, but it doesn't require, sort of all of them to be to be part of the process. It could be a subset of global governments who basically take on that trustee role. Obviously, it would be better if we had international organizations, and like the UN or the Paris Agreement that handled this. And we do have some international organizations that could take on that role, but it may not be absolutely necessary to establish the trust. If you had a subset of governments that could say we are the trustees going forward, and we've sort of been trying to pursue that line and to get at least a subset of the most vulnerable governments, perhaps, to set up the trust and get the idea going. And I think part of it is also just a public information campaign, just to get people to recognize that this is a joint asset that we all own together, and that it's being damaged and it's affecting our well-being. And so we should be holding the parties that damage that asset accountable. It turns out there's on the order of 90 entities in the world that are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions, all the major fossil fuel companies, cement companies. So they can be targeted and say, we're going to charge you for damages. And there are a few lawsuits actually in progress right now by a few states to sue fossil fuel companies for climate damages. There's also something called our Children's Trust, who's been suing the U.S. government to take responsibility for climate change. So there's some interesting things going on, both at the national and the international scale along these lines. But it's true, that's an issue, that we don't have a global government that has sort of sovereignty over the global commons.
Well, and the question too is, will the International Court of Justice ever step up to deal with cases like this? So it hasn't so far, but there are structures out, international global structures that might be able to handle it. And will they ever actually do that?
Yeah, no global government, probably for better or worse at this point, honestly. So I think Dan Cole had a couple of comments and interesting ideas in the chat. Do you wanna raise those, Dan?
Yeah, and just to respond to this most recent point that Ida made about the International Court of Justice, it operates on the basis of voluntary jurisdiction. So a state would have to agree to be sued.
That makes it not very helpful.
That makes it not very helpful. And with respect to Bob's comment about what's going on in the courts, I mean, there have been, in the Netherlands, there was one useful lawsuit. And there's another moving forward. I'm not exactly sure where in Europe. But in the U.S., it's been nothing, including the young people's lawsuit, which the Ninth Circuit.
There was one win in the U.S. In Washington State.
Oh, so at the state level, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, that's interesting.
So Dan,
Yeah.
Are you saying that our Children's Trust that suit has been dropped, or what's the status?
Yeah, I think the Ninth Circuit stopped it.
When did that happen?
I want to say 6 months ago, something like that. I don't know, but it's yeah, that's basically over. I don't think, frankly, that we can turn the climate change problem into a legal problem, rather than a international political problem that requires polycentric solutions. It just doesn't seem to be going that way. And that includes even the public trust doctrine, which I raised in my first comment in the chat. Public trust doctrine was invented by the US Supreme Court in the late 19th century. It's only been applied by that court. So states have adopted it, but only with respect to water resources in the states. No one's applied it to any other of the Roman law common property.
Oregon has for their state beaches.
Yeah, but that's true for state beaches generally. You're still dealing with a state resource below beyond the mean high tide line. Yeah, that's true in Indiana and pretty much every other state as well. But not to the atmosphere, not to the climate, nothing like that. And it would have to be the courts doing it. And by the way, even where it's used, it only means that the state cannot, sell it permanently to some. They can lease it to a private owner for 100 years. The public trust doctrine merely means that they cannot cede final ownership to some other entity, and it doesn't impose on them any particular obligations with respect to management. So I think there's that problem as well. I think Dean already made the point, other point that I was going to make. The distinction between prizes and patents is an interesting one. In that, in its original form as letters patent, just first created in France, these were awards. They were prizes, basically granted by the king or the queen, moved from France to England as well, that was doing this, and it was often, very much post hoc. It was after some innovation had shown its social utility that the creator of it was somehow given a reward with this letter patent. It did not necessarily create a monopoly property right in that person. The modern patent system, which was developed here in the US under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 patent clause or intellectual property clause, took this very different approach. And it's interesting now to sort of think about coming full circle back to something that's more like the original letters patent, although now it's even more interesting because they're not all created by the sovereign, right? You have a lot of these private organizations, so it's a much more polycentric system of awards. And that's it for my comments.
Thanks, Dan.
Our next question in the chat is from Cheng. And so I'll see if Cheng wants to ask his question about public education. And I also just wanted to tack something on to Cheng's question, which was whether we should think of public education as having additive characteristics. And is that different from the way we've thought about it before as having positive externalities? But Cheng, you want to ask about public education?
Now I'm working with my research program about educational networks. I just curious that sometimes the data from the educational assessment is like a secret for bureaucracy. It's hard for me to access all of this data. That is my question. I just curious that what type of these data should be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is, and I'm going to kind of roll back with a little bit of what Dan said as well, and then hit on Bill. But with any data information, there needs to be some kind of reward structure for it to be actually created, whether it's a technology or information. So patents and copyrights are a great thing in a lot of ways, even for things like information, to some extent. Because they've been misused quite a bit. You know, copyrights were 10 years after production when they first started. Now they're about 95 years or 100 years, maybe even, Dan, you might know, after author's death, right? And that's just because that's when Walt Disney died and when Mickey Mouse was created, and Disney has been lobbying the government to extend it by 5 years every 5 years. You know, that expires. And so I do think that there needs to be some kind of reward and protection for the original creator. And so for assessments, yes, I think that they should be held back probably for a little bit, but then things like that will improve education. Sharing things like assessments, like assignments, ideas will improve education. And we've seen that with the internet. People get ideas of how to run courses on the internet. Going back to Bill's kind of comment question, I think it can vary. Yes, so it should be looked as an additive in a lot of ways, I think. Personal opinion. I think that the more people working on education and even in the education system, the better. There is an issue of congestibility at some point that has to be considered. But I think with like any of these, there is some kind of balance point of where the trade-offs start becoming too much, when it's too congested and where it isn't. So, and I think understanding where those points are, and they will vary for depending what goods and services you're looking at. And so understanding that, and making sure that we're at that balance point, I think will be critical.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Jess, but just with a quick follow-up, I was also thinking of that additivity from the standpoint of the individual learner. And if, you know, back to your Zoom analogy, if you were the only educated person around, would the value of your education be enhanced because you have a monopoly on education, or would the value of your education be diminished because you don't have other educated people to interact with?
Okay.
Nobody would care.
Well, yeah.
Two finger on this
Or there's that. That's right.
Can I just want to add a little bit to this question, because it's something I've been wondering about as you've been talking, which has to do with the there's actually a large literature in sort of business and product adoption, right, and entrepreneurship about sort of patterns of use as a result of complementarity and additive characteristics, right? And so one of the things that they often talk about is like, that can tell us a whole lot about the trajectory and patterns of use over time, right? If we understand what the complementarities are and why it is, for instance, that like, you know, everybody has a QWERTY keyboard, and they do so because the more people use it, the more useful it is, right? You have this wonderful, hopefully a lot of you have read the wonderful piece about sort of how that happened with QWERTY. And so building on Bill's question, and then I will cede my time, I've sort of taken the power of moderator to ask a question, of course, but can sort of this, you know, adding this dimension of additivity help us think about patterns of use and patterns of consumption over time, given the sort of way that those concepts have been used in other literatures, right? Especially either to Bill's question, and Chang's question about education, but even if we could think about any environmental goods that we think of as additive, could we think about the patterns of use that could be understood or explained by thinking about the concept of additivity in this context?
So I think the concept of additivity can be beneficial when thinking about goods and how they're used. I think being careful on where we see this additivity. So with environmental goods, I can see it working in some ways, but I can also see the congestibility issue coming up really quickly. Just because there is, even though it looks massive, there is a finite amount of nature out there. we see it more and more as population goes up. So being careful how that is used. But so, and again, where's that balance point, right? Because often going out into nature, it's more fun to be with friends or, stuff like that. So pattern of use, but if you were in a park and there were millions of people, all of a sudden a little bit less fun. And so where is that point of congestibility with these additive goods? So sometimes they could be additive, and then there's sort of a downwards trend as they become more congestible. And so I think with every good and service, that balance point has to be looked at. So yes, I do think it's a potentially very useful way of looking at goods, but having the understanding that that may change as it's used more too.
Thank you. And so we're getting towards the end of our time, but we had a few more people. I think, Eric, you mostly had a comment in the chat if I saw. I'm not sure if that was a question or not that you wanted to pose.
Oh, that was just a comment, but then I followed up and it wasn't
Okay.
Anyway, so.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And then same with Forrest, if I'm not mistaken, similar situation. So interrupt me if I'm wrong, Forrest, but it sounded like you were having you were sort of commenting. So I think our final question was from.
Oh, actually, I did have a question.
Okay, great. If I can really quick, maybe Forrest could ask your question, and then Mike, and then have the panelists respond to both of you, if that makes sense for our timing. So Forrest, go ahead, and then Mike, and then we'll have our panelists respond.
Great, thank you very much. So one of the areas that I'm actually working in and looking at is how do you build a global commons to accelerate regeneration of the planet? And to me, it has to have certain features, which is A, it's got a social good primary purpose. B, it has a profitability component in it so that you can use a cooperative type model. And then C, it understands a starfish organization structure so that it decentralizes and allows the core activity to be taking place real close to the physical location, wherever that might be in the world, and enabling people to do this. So my question is A, have you ever seen or heard of this being done? 2, can a trust be used for this? And then 3, what's your idea of just your sense of what I've described and the feasibility?
Thanks, Forrest. Mike, did you want to ask your question? Then we'll let the panelists sort of respond to both and sort of round it out.
Sure, thanks. So I'll try to be efficient. A quick comment and then a question. The quick comment is just because I teach intellectual property law, and so that was my way into Commons and Lynn Ostrom's work. I just want to reinforce what, in different respects, Dean said and Dan said about the sort of configurability and fluidity of sort of the character of information and data resources and how legal systems can be changed over time to sort of define the attributes of different resources. And that leads to a related observation that the sort of, I think it was Bob who mentioned Mary Wood's book on public trust doctrine in environmental law. And she and I went to law school together. I've known her for 35 years. She's a genius of a person, but that area of law doesn't map onto the information and knowledge space very well, because it's not such a well-anchored doctrine in environmental law. But when you start looking at the kind of trust idea in the data and information space, you run into the problem of who's going to manage the trust. And the evidence that we have today, there's a lot of interest in data trusts today, but the evidence shows that the data trust will end up being governed by some large private company. The evidence from the Sidewalk Toronto project and Sidewalk Labs shows that they did not go into it with a polycentric mindset, and that's what helped blow that thing up. So that's kind of the preface to the question for Ida and everyone else, which is I'm drawn to the idea increasingly of polycentricity. Within Lynn's work, I started with the design principles and gradually have gotten away from them because they don't seem to work terribly well in the knowledge and information space. I'm more attracted to the polycentric idea. Dan highlighted that, and I'm wondering, Ida, how you weigh the different contributions of this tradition and you're thinking about the problems, and maybe invite the rest of the panel to comment on that as well.
Thank you, but briefly, if each of you could, sadly, we're gonna run out of time here pretty quick. In fact, our staff, Zoom jockey, has already had to exit. And so you are now in the less capable hands of a faculty member. This should scare you all, but please, panelists, please reply.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the question, Mike. And I do want to go back to something Dan said too. And he mentioned, it was interesting because he mentioned something like law wasn't designed for this, and the law isn't the way we solve the climate change problem. And I guess my response is, it's such a big problem. Why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we try at least in some aspects? Solution is, there's not going to be one solution. There's not going to be a silver bullet. Why not have law do its bit? It's helped to screw it up. It's helped to create climate change, right? As has every other institution in some way, as have we all in some way. Why shouldn't it be redesigned to some extent or made work to also solve the problem, not just create the problem? And so, yes, Mike, maybe Ostrom's principles aren't the best ones to use in the case of law. And maybe there are other better ways. And my point is, instead of defining the problem, let's figure out how law can be part of the solution. So, and I think that's true with any institutions. I was a negotiator for the UN for representing the Dominican Republic on climate change for a few years. In some ways, UN is the problem too, right? We all have our say in it, and yet, how do we make it into solution? And I would say the same thing to you guys, is how do we make law as part of the solution, not part of the problem? So, Bob, I'll let you answer the other question.
Well, just to follow up on that one, yeah, the law evolves, hopefully, and things change. I think Mary Wood's point was that the public trust doctrine could be expanded to cover many of these resources, because philosophically it sort of fits, and it's not necessarily the only way to change the law to take into account our current situation. So I think we need to push the legal system in new directions to be able to handle the new problems that we're facing. And I think part of that has to do with polycentric governance. It's not always clear in the conventional legal systems, who's responsible, where the property rights should lie. And so I think we need to really expand on that, and also expand this idea of common property rights. So how do we build that more into our routine things? And I think it goes beyond that. So part of what one of our co-authors on this paper was Paul Atkins, who, along with David Sloden Wilson and others, came out with this book, Pro-Social. So how do you apply, this is about how to applying Lynn's design principles, to a whole range of other social problems. So dealing with our social capital and our natural capital, I think, more effectively, and putting it into that diagram that Ida was showing, but also designing the legal and the economic institutions to deal with those types of assets in a way that can go forward. And the question about the global commons, yes, I think the common asset trust idea sort of fits with what you're talking about. I'd be interested in what you're how else you're sort of designing that system, but I think we do need an institution to manage both the global commons, the atmosphere, the oceans, the other natural capital and social capital assets that we're facing. So we're in a position where we really need some design work here to go on, some institutional design work. And it's not, I think our current set of institutions are really not not totally adequate to deal with these issues.
Well, and there's the piece that there's the comment of preserving what we have so it doesn't get reduced out, and then regenerating what we've got, which is really bringing together all the people. And so a lot of the thinking is around the need for platforms that are controlled by the members, that aren't extracting large amounts out, and that their purpose is really social good. And then enabling those to spawn, if you will, small companies all over the world involved in green regenerative activities as a source of their income and pleasure.
Yes. Great. Exactly.
Well,
thanks.
I appreciate you going over time for that. Thank you.
I just wanted to see if Dean had any last comments, because I think we heard from our other two panelists before we adjourn for the day. Dean, did you have any final?
All I want to say is thanks, everybody. I think we've gone over, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to not add anything at this point. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for a wonderful conversation. Thanks again, especially to our Australian panelists who got up so early to join us and provide such an interesting conversation. As was noted, a recording of this will be available on our Ostrom website if you'd like to revisit it. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing most of you at the Ostrom Center at some point in the future. Have
Thanks,
a great
everyone.
night/day.
Thanks for setting up, Bill.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye.